My next guest testified at the House Financial Services Committee on Friday in support of H.R. 1207. Thomas E. Woods, the author of 9 books, including 2 New York Times bestsellers, the most recent of which is called Meltdown, a free market look at why the stock market collapsed, the economy tanked, and government bailouts will make things worse. Tom, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thanks a million, Judge.
You know, I read your account of your testimony. I didn't get a chance to watch it because of other commitments here. And even though some people gave you a hard time, one in particular who thinks that 2 + 2 = 22, nevertheless, it seems as though that committee is going to put its stamp of approval on some form of some audit of the Fed at some time in the relatively near future.
That's certainly the impression I walked away with. I couldn't believe, and I'm sure Congressman Paul just mentioned, just how angry with the Fed all these congressmen were. Now, I don't know how much of this is grandstanding, but the very fact that they feel like this is an issue they can grandstand on is quite revealing, that this is an issue where they feel like there is some, even though it's still a minority of the population, nevertheless there is some value in appealing to a group of people in this country who are concerned about the unaccountable nature of the Fed. So, and also to hear every congressman say, even Democrats say, you know, we want to express our gratitude to Congressman Paul for how doggedly he's pursued this issue. I mean, this is not your usual congressional hearing, I'll put it that way.
No, it's not. Well, first of all, they usually don't have people like you there who understand the free market and who is so faithful to the Constitution and to our natural rights to remind them of their obligation to be faithful to those first principles as well. And secondly, this was until recently a one-man show. I mean, this entire H.R. 1207 and the entire national movement to expose the Fed for what it really is was conceived, created, promoted, and caused by one man whose persistence in arguing the truth has attracted others as disparate as Bernie Sanders and Dennis Kucinich on one side and John Boehner and Jim DeMint on the other side to the cause of auditing the Fed. This is all because of Congressman Paul's persistence.
Right, and of course he'll deny that because of his humility. I mean, he's you know, the most genuinely humble person I think I've ever met or heard of. But it's absolutely true, because there have been a number of people in Congress who have tried to put through a bill like this. Chairmen of these committees have tried in the past. There have been authors who have written books on this subject, and by and large, they've all been completely ignored and they've failed. Now, it's true that we've all benefited from books on this subject, but they haven't been in the mainstream. They've been studiously excluded from political discourse, but yet Ron Paul comes along and suddenly smashes through this, and it's no longer a sort of quaint curiosity to have questions about the Fed. Suddenly, it's almost mainstream in the sense that you can raise an issue about this institution, and people have to answer you. They can't just brush you off anymore. This guy has made this possible. And then at this hearing, we even had a couple of congressmen mentioning Ludwig von Mises and being concerned about the Fed actually being a contributing factor to the economic crisis rather than a stabilizer of it. I mean, these are new and exciting ways of thinking. And again, I don't know how long this is going to last, but I'm enjoying it while it's going on.
Well, you know that even if this passes, the Fed will do this kicking and screaming. I mean, for example, there are a number of lawsuits against the Fed now. Well, there are many, many lawsuits, but 2 with which I know you're familiar. Fox sued the Fed to get copies of documents involved in TARP, and Bloomberg sued the Fed, the exact same lawsuit, to get copies of documents involved in TARP. And the judge in the Fox case said the Fed doesn't have to comply with the Freedom of Information Act, and the judge in the Bloomberg case said the Fed does have to comply with the Freedom of Information Act. So Fox will appeal its loss, and the Fed will appeal its loss. But the Fed's lawyers have said to Fox's lawyers, whichever way this goes, we're going to the Supreme Court. TARP will be ancient history before the Supreme Court rules on this, even if you do get the documents. So, with that as their attitude, wouldn't you expect a kicking and screaming and stingy and resistant response even to a statute that authorized and compelled the audit of the Fed?
Absolutely. I mean, they're not going down without a fight, and they've lined up academic economists, many of whom are, in one way or another, indirectly on the payroll. I cited at the hearing, in response to a criticism from Barney Frank, I cited a really important paper by Larry White, who's now at George Mason University, showing how many monetary economists have gotten Fed research grants, or how many people connected to the Fed are published in the journals, and how many journals are dominated by, have editors that are connected to the Fed. I mean, it's just everywhere. I mean, there's no way you can make a career as a monetary economist at a top university if you're going to be seriously critical of this institution. They shut you out. I mean, this is well known to everybody. So they are ruthless, and so no, we shouldn't expect them to go quietly. They're going to go down. They're going to go down also by making a lot of warnings to us about, hey, if you try to do this, the result could be higher inflation fears or higher interest rates, whatever, which is an implicit, I think, threat. Almost like what Nicholas Biddle tried to do with the second bank of the U.S. in the 1830s, which was, if you're going to attack me, I'm going to try to contract the money supply and cause problems with the economy as a threat, so maybe you'll leave the bank alone. I don't know if the Fed would do that, but you could easily see them at least threatening that if they're not allowed to keep their secrecy, well, the financial markets will be unstable and this and that. To me, it seems like financial markets would be more stable if they had a grasp on what the Fed was doing.
Well, when I went to law school, which wasn't that long ago, such a threat would be called extortion. But I can hear it coming out of their mouths. Was anybody there from the Fed to counter what you said, or to make the argument that their incredible secrecy, we know more about the CIA than we do about the Fed, is actually intended by the Constitution and good for the economy?
Well, the only person there who spoke on behalf of the Fed was their general counsel, Mr. Alvarez, who spoke before me. And he, in effect, he did not address the constitutional question. He simply argued that for the Fed to engage in monetary policy activity effectively and to carry out its dual mandate of low unemployment and good and stable prices, try not to laugh at that. Then it needs this secrecy, because otherwise, if it is required to turn over various types of information, that will spook the markets. It'll spook foreign governments. It'll spook potential borrowers from the discount window if they feel like this stuff could be public knowledge. But when you think about this, the Fed now, and this is what Robert Wenzel pointed out. He runs a site, economicpolicyjournal.com. He was reading the Alvarez testimony, and he said, now look toward the end of this thing where Alvarez says, now here are some sorts of things we really want to keep secret. One is a lot of our dealings, specific dealings with foreign central banks and with foreign governments. So they're making deals with foreign governments, the details of which they want to keep secret, and that they sort of consider us to be uppity peons for even asking about. Well, for heaven's sake, what governments are these, and what agreements are these? How could you seriously, without being a stooge, argue that this is not a matter of interest for the American public that's required to hold and use the very dollars whose value is affected by these various transactions?
You know, you read my mind as to where I wanted to go next, and this, to me, is one of the most terrifying aspects of their secrecy. What might we discover if they are audited? I suppose one of the things we might discover is that the Federal Reserve has been conducting its own foreign policy, which is independent, or might be independent, of the American government's foreign policy, might even be adverse to the American government's foreign policy.
It could either be that, or it could be in collusion, for example, with the CIA. And this is not, I don't think this is by any means out of bounds or crazy. This is actually, to the contrary, this is just common sense, especially when you see the involvement in the CIA overseas in various elections. Where do they get the money to influence some of these elections? I mean, I'm sure there's a special fund somewhere, but, when you do have an accommodative Fed sitting there, that presumably is willing to trade favors in exchange for its continuing government monopoly and privileges. I mean, it's just common sense. So I think that is quite possible. It could, and there are other possibilities. Maybe the Fed is, maybe it's buying up stocks in certain financial companies to make them seem better than they are, to prop them up. I mean, who knows? These things are possible. The problem is we can't know for sure what these things are. So when you go in there and you're offering testimony, you can't engage in wild speculation and say
Right.
they might be doing this or that. All you can say is there's no good reason not to at least look.
But we don't know if, for example, the CIA's budget is X and it needs more than X, it goes to the Fed and gets X plus 2 or X plus 10 or 2 times X. And if the CIA can do that, can the Pentagon do it? Can this be done without the knowledge of the President and the Congress, even though the Constitution says all federal monies that are dispersed from the Treasury must come from specific authorizations enacted by the Congress?
Yeah, and in fact, that was the one person who really did raise the Constitution was, I hardly need to tell you, was Ron Paul. And he pointed out just the obvious fact, and he'd been talking about this beforehand, that the Constitution makes clear about appropriation bills and spending bills. I mean, these things are supposed to come from the Congress, and yet what the Fed, even in public, has been doing in some cases does seem like a kind of appropriation.